And it's much safer to act like the Persian messenger who goes away to hide rather than bring home the news of the battle lost. Talking about economics, you get a very interesting phenomenon that I've seen over and over again in a long life. You've got two products. Suppose they're complex technical product. Now you think under the laws of economics that if product A costs X, if product Y costs X minus something, it will sell better than if it sells at X plus something. But that's not so. In many cases, when you raise the price of the alternative product, it'll get a larger market share than it would when you make it lower than your competitor's product. That's because the bell, the Pavlovian bell, ordinarily there's a correlation between price and value. You have an information inefficiency. And so when you raise the price, the sales go up relative to your competitor. That happens again and again and again. It's a pure Pavlovian phenomenon, and you can say, well, the economists have figured this sort of thing out when they started talking about information inefficiencies. But that was fairly late in economics that they found such an obvious thing. And of course, most of them don't ask what causes the information inefficiencies. Well, one of the things that causes it is pure old Pavlov and his dog. Now you've got bias from Skinnerian association, operant conditioning, where you give the dog a reward and pound in the behavior that preceded the dog's getting the award. And of course, Skinner was able to create superstitious pigeons by having rewards come, by accident with certain occurrences. And of course, we all know people who are the human equivalents of superstitious pigeons. That's a very powerful phenomenon. And of course, operant conditioning really works. The people in the center who think that operant conditioning is important are very much right. It's just that Skinner overdid it a little. Where you see in business just perfectly horrible results from psychologically rooted tendencies is in accounting. If you take Westinghouse, which blew $2 or $3 billion pre-tax at least, loaning developers to build hotels and virtually 100% loans. Now you say any idiot knows that there's one thing you don't like, it's a developer, and another you don't like, it's a hotel. And to make 100% loan to a developer who's going to build a hotel. But this guy, he probably was an engineer or something, and he didn't take psychology any more than I did, and he got out there in the hands of these slick salesmen operating under their version of incentive cost bias, where any damn way of getting Westinghouse to do it was considered normal business, and they just blew it. That would never have been possible if the accounting system hadn't been such that for the initial phase of every transaction, it showed wonderful financial results. So people who have loose accounting standards are just inviting perfectly horrible behavior in other people, and it's a sin. It's an absolute sin. If you carried bushel baskets full of money through the ghetto and made it easy to steal, that would be a considerable human sin, because you'd be causing a lot of bad behavior, and the bad behavior would spread. Similarly, an institution that gets sloppy accounting commits a real human sin, and it's also a dumb way to do business, as Westinghouse has so wonderfully proved. Oddly enough, nobody mentions, at least nobody I've seen, what happened with Joe Jett and Kidder Peabody. The truth of the matter is the accounting system was such that by punching a few buttons, the Joe Jetts of the world could show profits, and profits that showed up in things that resulted in rewards and esteem and every other thing that human being. Well, the Joe Jetts are always with us, and they're not really to blame, in my judgment at least. But that bastard who created that foolish accounting system, who, so far as I know, has not been flayed alive, ought to be. Seventh, bias from reciprocation tendency, including the tendency of one in a role to act as other persons expect. Well, here again, Cialdini does a magnificent job at this, and you're all going to be given a copy of Cialdini's book. And if you have half as much sense as I think you do, you will immediately order copies for all of your children and several of your friends. You will never make a better investment. It is so easy to be a patsy for what he calls the compliance practitioners of this life. But at any rate, reciprocation tendency is a very, very powerful phenomenon, and Cialdini demonstrated this by running around a campus, and he asked people to take juvenile delinquents to the zoo. And it was a campus, and so 1 in 6 actually agreed to do it. And after he'd accumulated the statistical output, he went around on the same campus, and he asked other people, he said, gee, would you devote 2 afternoons a week to taking juvenile delinquents somewhere and suffering greatly yourself to help them? And there he got 100% of the people to say no. But after he'd made the first request, he backed off a little. He said, well, would you at least take them to the zoo 1 afternoon? He raised the compliance rate from 1/3 to 1/2. He got 3 times the success by just going through the little ask for a lot and back off. Now, if the human mind on a subconscious level can be manipulated that way, and you don't know it, well, I always use the phrase, you're like a one-legged man in an ass-kicking contest. You are really giving a lot of quarter to the external world that you can't afford to give. And on this so-called role theory, where you tend to act in the way that other people expect, that's reciprocation, if you think about the way society is organized. And a guy named Zimbardo had people at Stanford divide into 2 pieces. One were the guards and the other were the prisoners. And they started acting out roles as people expected. He had to stop the experiment after about 5 days. He was getting into human misery and breakdown and pathological behavior. I mean, it was awesome. However, Zimbardo is greatly misinterpreted. It's not just reciprocation tendency and role theory that caused that. It's consistency and commitment tendency. Each person, as he acted as a guard or a prisoner, the action itself was pounding in the idea. Wherever you turn, this consistency and commitment tendency is affecting you. In other words, what you think may change what you do, but perhaps even more important, what you do will change what you think. And you can say everybody knows that. I want to tell you I didn't know it well enough early enough. 8. Now this is a Lollapalooza, and Henry Kaufman wisely talked about this. Bias from over-influence by social proof, that is, the conclusions of others, particularly under conditions of natural uncertainty and stress. And here, one of the cases the psychologist used is Kitty Genovese, where all these people, I don't know, 50, 60, 70, just sat and did nothing while she was slowly murdered. Now, one of the explanations is everybody looked at everybody else and nobody else was doing anything, and so there's automatic social proof that the right thing to do is nothing. That's not a good enough explanation for Kitty Genovese, in my judgment. That's only part of it. There are microeconomic ideas in gain-loss ratios and so forth that also come into play. I think time and time again in reality, psychological notions and economic notions interplay. And the man who doesn't understand both is a damn fool. Big shot businessmen get into these waves of social proof. Do you remember some years ago when one oil company bought a fertilizer company? And every other major oil company practically ran out and bought a fertilizer company. And there was no more damn reason for all these oil companies to buy fertilizer companies. But they didn't know exactly what to do, and if Exxon was doing it, it was good enough for Mobil or vice versa. And of course, I think they're all gone now. It was a total disaster. Now let's talk about efficient market theory, a wonderful economic doctrine that had a long vogue in spite of the experience of Berkshire Hathaway. In fact, one of the economists who won, he shared a Nobel Prize. And as he looked at Berkshire Hathaway year after year, which people would throw in his face as saying maybe the market isn't quite as efficient as you think, he said, well, it's a 2 sigma event. And then he said we were a 3 sigma event. And then he said we were a 4 sigma event. And he finally got up to 6 sigmas. Better to add a sigma than change a theory, just because the evidence comes in differently. And of course, when this share of a Nobel Prize went into money management himself, he sank like a stone. If you think about the doctrines I've talked about, namely, 1, the power of reinforcement. After all, you do something and the market goes up and you get paid and rewarded and applauded and what have you. You're getting a lot of reinforcement if you make a bet in a market and the market goes with you. Also, there's social proof. I mean, the prices in the market are the ultimate form of social proof, reflecting what other people think. And so the combination is very powerful. Why would you expect general market levels to always be totally efficient, say even in 1973, 4 at the pit, or in 1970, 2 or whatever it was when the Nifty 50 were in their heyday. If these psychological notions are correct, you would expect some waves of irrationality, which carry general levels so they're inconsistent with reason. 9. What made these economists love the efficient market theory is the math was so elegant. And after all, math was what they'd learned to do. The man with a hammer, every problem tends to look pretty much like a nail. The alternative truth was a little messy. And they'd forgotten the great economist Keynes, whom I think said, better to be roughly right than precisely wrong. 9. Bias from contrast caused distortions of sensation, perception, and cognition. Here, the great experiment that Cialdini does in his class is he takes 3 buckets of water. One's hot, one's cold, and one's room temperature. He has the student stick his left hand in the hot water and his right hand in the cold water. Then he has them remove the hands and put them both in the room temperature bucket. And of course, with both hands in the same bucket of water, one seems hot and the other seems cold, because the sensation apparatus of man is over-influenced by contrast. It has no absolute scale. It's got a contrast scale in it. And it's a scale with quantum effects in it, too. It takes a certain percentage change before it's noticed. Maybe you've had a magician remove your watch. I certainly have, without your noticing it. It's the same thing. He's taking advantage of contrast type troubles in your sensory apparatus. But here the great truth is that cognition mimics sensation, and the cognition manipulators mimic the watch-removing magician. In other words, people are manipulating you all day long on this contrast phenomenon. Cialdini cites the case of the real estate broker, and you got the rube that's been transferred into your town, and the first thing you do is you take the rube out, 2 of the most awful overpriced houses you've ever seen. And then you take the rube to some moderately overpriced house, and then you stick them. And it works pretty well, which is why the real estate salesmen do it. And it's always going to work. And the accidents of life can do this to you, and it can ruin your life. In my generation, when women lived at home until they got married, I saw some perfectly terrible marriages made by highly desirable women because they lived in terrible homes. And I've seen some terrible second marriages which were made because there were slight improvements over an even worse first marriage. And you think you're immune from these things and you laugh, and I want to tell you, you aren't. And my favorite analogy, I can't vouch for the accuracy of. I have this worthless friend I like to play bridge with, and he's a total intellectual amateur that lives on inherited money. But he told me once something I really enjoyed hearing. He said, Charlie, he says, if you throw a frog into very hot water, the frog will jump out. But if you put the frog in room temperature water and just slowly heat the water up, the frog will die there. Now, I don't know whether that's true about a frog, but it sure as hell true about many of the businessmen I know. And there again, it is the contrast phenomenon. These are hotshot, high-powered people. I mean, these are not fools. If it comes to you in small pieces, you're likely to miss. So you have to, if you're going to be a person of good judgment, you have to do something about this warp in your head where it's so misled by mere contrast. Bias from over-influence by authority. Well, here the Milgram experiment, as it's caused, I think there have been 1,600 psychological papers written about Milgram. And he had a person posing as an authority figure, trick ordinary people into giving what they had every reason to expect was heavy torture by electric shock to perfectly innocent fellow citizens. And the experiment has been, he was trying to show that why Hitler succeeded and a few other things. And so this really caught the fancy of the world. Partly it's so politically correct. And over-influenced by authority has another you'll like this one. You got a pilot and a co-pilot. The pilot is the authority figure. They don't do this in airplanes, but they've done it in simulators. They have the pilot do something where the co-pilot, who's been trained in simulators a long time, he knows he's not to allow the plane to crash. They have the pilot to do something where an idiot co-pilot would know the plane was going to crash. but the pilot's doing it and the co-pilot is sitting there and the pilot is the authority figure, 25% of the time the plane crashes. I mean, this is a very powerful psychological tendency. It's not quite as powerful as some people think, and I'll get to that later. 11, bias from deprival superreaction syndrome, including bias caused by present or threatened scarcity, including threatened removal of something almost possessed but never possessed. Here I took the Munger dog. Lovely, harmless dog. The only way to get that to bite you was to try and take something out of its mouth after it was already there. And any of you who have tried to do takeaways in labor negotiations will know that the human version of that dog is there in all of us. And I had a predecessor on a little island where I have a house, and his next door neighbor put a little pine tree in that was about 3 feet high, and it turned his 180-degree view of the harbor into 179 3/4. Well, they had a blood feud like the Hatfields and McCoys, and it went on and on and on. And I mean, people are really crazy about minor decrements down. And then, if you act on them, you get into reciprocation tendency, because you don't just reciprocate affection, you reciprocate animosity, and the whole thing can escalate. And so, huge insanities can come from just subconsciously overweighing the importance of what you're losing or almost getting and not getting. And the extreme business case here was New Coke. Now, Coca-Cola has the most valuable trademark in the world. We're the major shareholder. I mean, I think we understand that trademark. Coke has armies of brilliant engineers, lawyers, psychologists, advertising executives, and so forth. And they had a trademark on a flavor, and they'd spent the better part of 100 years getting people to believe that trademark had all these intangible values too. And people associated it with a flavor. And so they were going to tell people not that it was improved, because you can't improve flavor. If a flavor is a matter of taste, I mean, you may improve a detergent or something, but telling you're going to make a major change in a flavor. I mean, so they got this huge deprival superreaction syndrome. Pepsi was within weeks of coming out with old Coke in a Pepsi bottle, which would have been the biggest fiasco in modern times. Perfect, perfect insanity. And by the way, both guys are just wonderful about it. I mean, they just joke. I mean, Keogh always says, I must have been away on vacation. He participated in every single... He's a wonderful guy. And by the way, Goisveta is a wonderful, smart guy, an engineer. Smart people make these terrible boners. How can you not understand deprival superreaction syndrome? But people do not react symmetrically to loss and gain. Now, maybe a great bridge player like Zecker does, but that's a trained response. Ordinary people, subconsciously affected by their inborn tendencies. Bias from envy, jealousy. Well, envy, jealousy made what, 2 out of the 10 commandments? Those of you who have raised siblings, you know about or tried to run a law firm or investment bank or even a faculty. I've heard Warren say 6 times, it's not greed that drives the world, but envy. Here again, you go through the psychology survey courses, and you go to the index, envy, jealousy, 1,000-page book. It's blank. There's some blind spots in academia, but it's an enormously powerful thing, and it operates to a considerable extent on a subconscious level, and anybody who doesn't understand it is taking on defects he shouldn't have. Bias from chemical dependency. Well, we don't have to talk about that. We've all seen so much of it, but it's interesting how it always causes moral breakdown if there's any need, and always involves massive denial. See, it aggravates what we talked about earlier in the aviator case, the tendency to distort reality so that it's endurable. Bias from misgambling compulsion. Well, here Skinner made the only explanation you'll find in the standard psychology survey course. He, of course, created a variable reinforcement rate for his pigeons, his mice, and he found that would pound in the behavior better than any other reinforcement pattern. And he says, aha, I've explained why gambling is such a powerful, addictive force in a civilization. I think that is, to a very considerable extent, true. But being Skinner, he seemed to think that was the only explanation. But the truth of the matter is that the devisers of these modern machines and techniques know a lot of things that Skinner didn't know. For instance, a lottery. You have a lottery where you get your number by lot, and then somebody draws a number by lot. It gets lousy play. You get a lottery where people get to pick their number. Get big play. Again, it's this consistency and commitment thing. People think that if they've committed to it, it has to be good. And the minute they've picked it themselves, it gets an extra validity. After all, they thought it and they acted on it. And then if you take slot machines, you get bar, lemon. That happens again and again and again. You get all these near misses. Well, that's deprival superreaction syndrome. Boy, do the people who create the machines understand human psychology. And if you got, for the high IQ crowd, they've got poker machines where you make choices. So you can play blackjack, so to speak, with the machine. It's wonderful what we've done with our computers to ruin a civilization. And at any rate, misgambling compulsion is a very, very powerful and important thing. Look at what's happening to our country. Every Indian reservation, every river town, and look at the people who are ruined by it with the aid of their stockbrokers and others. And again, if you look in the standard textbook of psychology, you'll find practically nothing on it except maybe one sentence talking about Skinner's rats. That is not an adequate